Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roswell Encina, the Chief Communications Officer for the Library of Congress. And because we can't say this enough, on behalf of my wonderful colleagues, welcome to the 2022 Library of Congress National Book Festival. It's great to see this huge crowd here in the stage. Thank you again. And if you missed any of the authors today, please go to loc.gov/bookfest, and you could catch up with some of our marvelous authors that's been part of the festival so far. I know we've got a lot to cover, so on to our discussion. Almost as long as how old this nation is, there's always been conspiracies kind of wrapped around it. Whether it's from the Revolutionary War, to the Cold War, to the assassination of JFK, to the murders of innocent children in Newtown, and from September 11th to January 6th. Today, we are here to discuss these struggles that's been dealt to our nation. Joining us today is the Professor of History at Boston University and the author of the book, The Brethren, A Story of Faith and Conspiracy in Revolutionary America, author Brendan McConville. And joining him is New York Times writer and the author of the new book, Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy and the Battle for Truth, Elizabeth Williamson. Welcome to both of you. Elizabeth, I want to ask you first. Just a couple weeks ago, the verdict for Alex Jones came down. Have you spoken to any of the families, and how are they reacting to it?
Roswell, I did almost immediately, and actually throughout the trial, which I was covering for the New York Times, they were weighing in, and they were particularly gratified by the confrontation in the courtroom that Scarlett Lewis, whose son Jesse Lewis died at Sandy Hook, had with Alex Jones. For 90 minutes, she was on the stand, and she addressed her responses to every question to him personally and held him to account. So that was something that really cheered them.
How are they coping? I know this is not the end of the line yet. There's a couple more hearings. How are they feeling moving forward?
I hesitate to characterize, anyone or ascribe any one feeling to the entire group. Or even to speak for them, but they are absolutely determined to hold Alex Jones and the other conspiracy theorists who supplied his content and harassed their families to account.
When I started, I said, conspiracies have been part of the country for more than 200 years. Brendan's book started 200 years ago. But I do want to quote something from Elizabeth's book, then I'm going to pivot to you, Brendan. You write, conspiracy rumors can be a collective response to psychological threats, which DeFonso defines as an attack by outsider on a group's identity, values, faith, or politics. Those four last items seem to be the common denominator from 200 years ago to today. What started it back then?
Conspiracy theory runs back in Anglo-American thinking to the reign of Elizabeth I at least, and probably even before that. And so you have a kind of belief that somehow people either believe that their rights or their liberties are being infringed on, their group is being threatened, and there's been different contexts in which that's occurred. But it's something that's deeply ingrained in Anglo-American political and social thought, that somehow liberty or personal autonomy or group identity is somehow always at threat by those in power. And so that is a very common theme in Anglo-American political thinking from the time of Elizabeth I at the sort of beginning of the late 16th and early 17th century until today, and as that Elizabeth's quote suggests.
Does it seem like the common denominator of fear and everything else is what's being weaponized to move these theories forward, whether it's fear or religion or misinformation?
I'm going to punt to Brendan because he has a lot to say about this in his book.
It's often, I think, in cases where people feel, as you say, they feel that something is threatened. And I'm unsurprised in the sense of what Elizabeth's written about that the issue, the Second Amendment issue, was in a sense at the core of it, since it's one of the central fears. And that fear has run, again, that runs back to the revolutionary generation. It's fear of a standing army, fear of an overreaching government, fear that the government is going to somehow infringe your rights, or you're somehow infringe on your personal autonomy. And that has run back deeply in the society. And of course, it was a major issue in the revolutionary generation. And it's why it also ultimately leads to the Second Amendment. And continues to be an issue, has continued to be an issue since then.
One of the big things you talked about, Elizabeth, in your book is the Second Amendment and freedom of speech, which tends to be the, I guess, defense for many of them. So where is the line there? When is it freedom of speech, and when is it you're inciting a rumor or a bad conspiracy theory?
Well, during the trial, the lawyers for the Sandy Hook families had a great phrase that I think should be put on a T-shirt, actually. It said, "Speech is free, but lies you pay for." And so when you're spreading lies that harm vulnerable people, or any people, and are patently false and have been debunked countless times, there is a penalty for that in our law. Free speech does not protect that, although conspiracy theorists generally tend to claim that it does. Attacks on people, knowing that they are false, is prohibited. That the First Amendment does not protect that.
How did they deal with it 200 years ago?
In other words, conspiracy theory? In a sense, the revolution mobilized on the belief that a conspiracy had corrupted the British monarchy and the British ministry, the British government, and the revolution was mobilized on that belief. Once the revolutionary regime began to take shape, then there were people who believed that that regime had been corrupted. So it works in a sense both ways. Both the regime and the regime's people who come to oppose the regime both use that kind of what we would consider a conspiratorial language, because they believed that the dispensation of power was controlled by groups of individuals or groups of individuals who wanted to gather as much as that power to themselves. And even in something like the fear that the Second Amendment will be abridged, there's that fear that it's somehow you're going to lose that. And that was part of the way the revolution was, as I say, mobilized and resisted in certain respects.
So much has changed, obviously, since the Revolutionary War. One of the big things, of course, is the factor of media when it comes to reporting what's happening. You wrote about this very well, Elizabeth. How does bad reporting contribute to bad theories?
So what happens in the chaos after a major event or a mass tragedy is, of course, that in the rush to report to Americans what happened, mistakes are made. I saw after a recent mass shooting this idea of there's rarely a second shooter, but that is something that often crops up, for example. So there's always this balance to be struck between getting the information to people quickly and making sure that it's accurate. And what conspiracy theorists after these events tend to do is point to anomalies in the reporting and say that these are proof of the fact that it didn't happen that way, that the official narrative is false or wrong or willfully being misrepresented. And that is where you have to kind of pitch a perfect game when you're reporting on these tragedies, although that is just not really possible in many cases because you're getting information from authorities who themselves are trying to piece it together.
As a reporter, I've been meaning to ask you this. During breaking news like this, in a very competitive media market, people just tend to report whatever is told to them. Have things changed in newsrooms to make sure misinformation doesn't go out there that could be weaponized later?
So I see really hopeful developments in the reporting after these mass tragedies in particular. And here I want to give a shout out to my colleague Sewell Chan at the Texas Tribune, who is here in the audience, and his staff reported after Uvalde. And you can see the attention being paid not only to making sure that details are correct, questioning, and that was very important after Uvalde because the police narrative was false and self-protective, and that is still being sort of unpacked by the media. And you also have to be respectful to the families in doing things like not repetitively naming the gunman, not focusing on the gunman to the exclusion of the victims and their families, and putting them first and foremost in your reporting and being respectful in doing so.
Now, aside from the mainstream media, the one big kind of medium that's been used is social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. How did these entities made things worse for the families of Sandy Hook?
In reporting on the event or the conspiracy theories?
Actually, both.
Oh, okay. So again, you have people who seize on the initial reporting to sort of say, you know, this detail was wrong, and so therefore this part of the narrative or even the entire narrative is incorrect, or is being manufactured or, you know, concocted by the federal government in particular. But social media in general is what gives a megaphone to people who question these events and these official reports. And so that is something, you know, conspiracy theorists and you know, Brendan can speak to this, you know, were often isolated, or in earlier times, they had to rely on word of mouth or, you know, print, but social media allows a lie to really speed around the world and gain adherents that number not just in the handfuls or, you know, in the scores, but in the millions, and that happens within minutes.
Pivot back to you, Brendan. Obviously, there was no Twitter during the Revolutionary War.
Thank goodness.
How did people get together to, you know, to form a group?
Right. It's interesting. The revolutionary generation was also living through the expansion of the means of communication, just in the same way that we are. Newspapers, pamphlets, broad bills, speeches, sermons. So information got out on a particularly as the revolution mobilizes in 1774 and 1775, the opportunities to spread information increased geometrically. And that's why you get this you get a kind of uncontrolled situation in some respects about the way information is passing, what amounts to a kind of struggle over what information is accurate, what's not accurate. And one of the things that I have thought in about our own time and about what Elizabeth writes about is that we're engaged in a radical experiment in the democratization of the spread of knowledge, or a massive new market in information. And it's very hard for people to sort that information and come to an understanding of even basic things. And so you have the legacy media and you have social media. There's a tremendous amplification in what's available, and there's not much of an amplification. If anything, there's a decline in the ability to make sense of what you're hearing and what's accurate and what's not. So that's something that's gone on, and it went on with the revolutionary generation as well. One of the big fears in the revolutionary generation is the fear that Protestantism, particularly this is true in 74 and 75, is somehow being undermined by hidden Catholics in the upper end of the British government, including the king himself ultimately. But it takes hold, even though it's completely false. That belief. There was no Catholic conspiracy in the British ministry, but they believed that there was. The Catholics were trying to seize control of the British Empire.
Was it the case back then, like nowadays, as you mentioned, social media could really amplify things. Well, back then, maybe the lack of information kind of really allowed things to percolate?
In many respects, what happens is that there is a lack of kind of control of information. And what had happened in the revolutionary generation is that two new kinds of institutions appear: committees of safety and committees of correspondence. And so they have a kind of agenda in their behavior, and they communicate in certain ways. And a lot of people are either left out of that, or they have a sort of incomplete sense of what's going on, and so they're left to sort of try to sort things out themselves. And of course, I think that's not that different from people trying to sort through what they read, which website is valid and which one is being produced by someone who doesn't know anything about the situation and just has an axe to grind, a point to grind.
One thing I didn't know, Elizabeth, actually, because of some of the families of Sandy Hook, they kind of triggered or started the domino effects of how social media were regulating what information is put out there. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, when we speak about the dramatic uptake in social media, so in the book, I talked to a woman named Lori Haas, whose daughter was injured in the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I asked her, you know, and in the aftermath of that, Lori became very active in the gun control movement. So she was out there a lot. She was demonstrating, she was speaking before state legislatures, she was pushing for new gun legislation. So she's very visible. And I asked her, did anyone come up to you and you know, or contact you on social media and call you a liar or a crisis actor or someone who was, you know, part of a government plot? And she actually went through her Facebook page and she said, no, I really don't see anything. But the thing was, that was 2007. Sandy Hook shooting occurred in 2012. In those 5 years, in 2007, there were maybe 5 million tweets sent out a day. In 2012, there were 5 million every second. On Facebook, when Lori was not finding anything in 2007, there were 20 million Facebook users around the world. 5 years later, when Sandy Hook happened, there were 1 billion. So you can just see, you know, the speed and the virality that happens when false theories are put out. And as Brendan said, and the impossibility of vetting which of these Facebook accounts is accurate, which one's based on the facts, which one is just malicious.
One of the parents, I can't remember his name, the father, who's the one who really took action of
Lenny Posner.
Yes, to making sure that these internet trolls were held accountable for what they were being posted. What method did he do to make sure that Twitter and Facebook and YouTube did the right thing?
So Lenny Posner, who is the father of Noah Posner, the youngest Sandy Hook victim, had a technology background. So he could see that Sandy Hook was not just a one-off theory or even something built on gun control and out of the, you know, the realistic expectation that gun legislation would result from this tragedy. What he knew was that this was a foundational story for how misinformation and false narratives have spread in our society, and was a predictor, a kind of warning bellwether for where we are today in the post-January 6th environment and the kind of world of lies that we're steeped with online. So he began by trying to appeal, as you would, to the social media companies. Hello, YouTube, there are thousands of these videos out here calling us liars and crisis actors and saying that this is false. Facebook, can you take some of this material down? You know, less so Twitter because it was, you know, smaller platform. He got nothing. He describes it to, you know, shouting at a locked iron door, open up. He never even got anything relating to a response. You know, he got auto messages and things like that. So he started to use his power as a grieving father to call attention to what was going on here. And so he did op-eds in the newspaper. He got some interviews, very powerful interviews on the radio through BBC, and he called out these companies and shamed them. And he also called out the names of individual conspiracy theorists who were generating so much mistruth that his family was being threatened and harassed and being forced to move because people kept publishing their home address online. So he started to talk about the secondary trauma that was being inflicted on them and the actual danger that they were in because of these lies. And if there's anything the social media companies respond to, it's public shaming. And that's what he was doing. So he began doing that. And he continues to do that. He is a true hero of this story. And the final thing that he has done, and now they do pay attention to him, they go to him first, and he reports this material on behalf of not just the Sandy Hook families, but a whole array of people who are being tormented online.
The numbers you were sharing earlier of how, you know, social media just progressed since Virginia Tech is kind of staggering. Brenda, I want to ask you, from the Revolutionary War to even just the Virginia Tech time or even just during September 11th, conspiracy theorists always felt like they were just on the fringe. Then I hate to say it, they've become a little bit more mainstream now.
Yeah.
Why do you think it was better controlled 200 years ago?
I think it wasn't always better controlled. When the society is in crisis, when there's a sense of disorder, these kinds of things move to the center of, can move to the center of discussion. When the society has more stability, there's less chance for that movement to occur. One thing that, with what Elizabeth said, you have a vast, in the velocity and scale of information, you have this vast change. This happened in the revolutionary generation as well, and it took them 40 years to stabilize the society. The American Revolution doesn't really fully stabilize until the second party system emerges in the 1820s, which is 40 years after the revolution and after you have this explosion in print culture. In our own time, we're just at the beginning of this explosion of social media, and it really is a test to see in our society of how we can, have a stable society with this much information moving this quickly, and with people very sort of struggling to make sense of that information and how fast it moves and what people say. And people can tweet and say, I think it's this way, and someone says that. It breaks down surety of understanding in a very sort of concrete way.
What's scary is it feels like history repeats itself. The story in your book is, you could see the parallels with what happened with the governor of Michigan. Would you like to tell the audience that?
Yeah, in both cases, there's strong, I think, a strong parallel in the sense that you have a group of people who feel like the governor of the state they're in is a threat and is involved in some kind of broader action against them. And in the case of the book I write, against their Protestant religion, against their traditional practices. And so they ultimately, they move into a position where they think we're going to kill not only the governor of North Carolina, but the entire governing elite of North Carolina. They're going to try to kill them amid a diversionary slave uprising, which they're going to start. And so you get something, same thing with the governor of Michigan, in the sense that you have a group. I think what's the real parallel is that the people who were hostile or wanted to kidnap the governor of Michigan and the people who had this assassination plot in 1777, they were both sort of extreme manifestations of much broader belief systems that had then been carried out to sort of their extreme and sort of irrational degree, where in some case, the fears they had in North Carolina in 1777 was that their governor didn't share their religious beliefs, which was true. But they, nonetheless, I mean, they carried it out to the degree we're going to kill the entire governing elite of North Carolina and start a slave uprising to get it done. Similarly, the idea that somehow kidnapping the governor of Michigan, where does that go? It's a strange sort of solution to a problem of, gee, I don't like the governor of Michigan, maybe I'll vote for the other candidate instead. It's a strange response, right? I can vote for somebody else. I don't have to kidnap the governor.
Now, we're going to be taking questions shortly. There's 2 microphones here in the aisle, so if you have a question, just come up. But before we get there, we'll keep on talking here. I do have a question, Elizabeth. Reading your book, both your research and your reporting are just both outstanding for both of them. It does leave you feeling a little hopeless, I should say. I just want to read one. I want to read one passage from your book. And I mean that with a compliment, by the way.
I mean it in the best possible way.
You write, you not only do false flag claims around Sandy Hook persist, they have metastasized to virtually every mass shooting since. It feels like since Sandy Hook, which is hard to believe, which was 10 years ago, and just how more mass shootings have progressed in the next 10 years after that. The rumorville and the theories just got worse.
Yeah.
How do you think we could get a hold of all this?
So it is true that, now 1/5 of Americans, after every high-profile mass shooting, espouse the belief that that shooting was faked or staged. That's a shocking statistic. And it doesn't point to, and I think it's really important to say this, it doesn't point to politics or ideology as much as it does to psychology. And that's, in that people find a sense of social belonging in adhering to these conspiracy theories. They find a community online. They are often lonely. The ones I interviewed for the book often have trauma in their backgrounds. They're looking for something, and they're looking obviously in the wrong places. But it is the reason that once you try to get someone to disavow these conspiracy theories, they are extremely resistant. They've often reinvented themselves. Lenny Posner tells me, don't say that, that they have developed an entirely new identity. I interview a woman in the book who had a house cleaning business in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Being one of the most pernicious conspiracy theorists around Sandy Hook allowed her to reinvent herself as an author, a researcher, an investigative journalist. This is really important for people. So there's been a lot of research into trying to get people to be suspicious of these theories, use that natural suspicion in their personalities and their natures, and that skepticism, and apply it to when they see this material online. And there has been a lot of very hopeful success and some breakthroughs in that area. The other hopeful thing, I think, is just the fact that I'm so gratified so many people are here. I mean, it really says that people are recognizing the message that the Sandy Hook families have sent, like by talking with me, and that they send every day through these lawsuits, and that's that this is a problem. We are being steeped in a world of lies. It's affecting not only us as individuals, but our democracy, and that is huge. So that's hopeful. People are paying attention, and people who are in a position to do something about this, whether it's the social media companies tightening up on their policies, whether it's Congress looking at new forms of legislation, and this, by the way, is a bipartisan effort, and whether it is, the big thinkers out there looking at the psychology behind this and trying to figure this out, those are all very hopeful signs.
Brendan, what can we learn from history to move forward?
I think that, going back to what Elizabeth said here, it's the ability, as we become more, just as in the revolutionary generation, people begin to come to an understanding of how do I sort information that seems rational to me from what does not. And I think that that's where we are, but it takes, as I said in my earlier comment, it takes time. These social media things are new. They come, basically, you're talking about from 2012. Just 10 years seems like a long time, but it's not that long, given the nature and the way that they've insinuated themselves. How many people here in our audience have sat in bed looking at social media, looking at tweets, looking at Facebook? Almost everyone will have. They've insinuated themselves into every corner of our existence. And so it will take a long time. But if you look back, earlier societies who went through a similar, although much less dramatic and much less rapid, but some of the paralleling things, they do go forward. They do find, a path forward in a sense of creating a more stable polity and stable order in their society. And that's really the hopeful thing. It's it's also an issue of education. That if you understand that people aren't going to fake shooting a 7-year-old child, it's hard for me to believe that anyone could warrant that, could believe that. But it is a question of education and looking at the society, I think.
All right. We've got a lot of people here lined up for some questions. We'll start with this gentleman right here.
Thank you both for coming out. I have a question about Sandy Hook in general and Alex Jones in specific. To what extent do you think, well, he has made an obscene amount of money on his website, selling things like meal prep kits and male supplements and what have you. To what extent do you think he sincerely believes what he talks about versus how much do you think he's just weaponizing the act of riling other people up so that he can then make money?
Thank you. It's a great question. So as one of the individuals who I interviewed for the book who used to work for InfoWars told me, it doesn't matter if he believes it, and by the way, he knows it happened. It's that people in his audience of tens of millions, many of them believe the lie that he's spreading about it. His business model is ingenious. He sells products, as you said, to people who distrust traditional medicine, established science, the federal government, and many of our institutions. So there are doomsday preppers buying, dried food and things for their shelters. They're buying diet supplements, which is an enormous business for him, people who distrust traditional medicine. So he has definitely built an empire around these lies. And you could see, and I trace this in the book, that traffic to his website surges when he spoke about Sandy Hook. So it resonates with people, and that leads to sales. So it is a very cynical and ingenious business model that he's pursued, and it is not based on any genuine suspicion around the event itself.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
We'll go here to my left.
Hello, my name is Alex. Misinformation and conspiracy can affect anyone. I believe we often feel it can be some distance problem that doesn't directly impact us, particularly when we see it on the confined realm of social media. Because of this, when misinformation takes root in our personal lives or those close to us, we can often be caught off guard. How would you recommend we navigate a conversation that effectively addresses the dangers of misinformation without damaging our interpersonal relationships with others?
Brendan, do you want to take that?
I don't know if I have a recommendation for that. I mean, ultimately, one of the challenges we're facing is that it really is ultimately up to each individual to weigh what they're doing, to weigh their exposure to social media, to weigh their exposure to technology in certain terms of their the consumption of information. But I do think that it's important that if you're looking at something as tragic and as important as something like Sandy Hook, that you come to an understanding that, look, I need to have an understanding of the sort of history and the sort of background to what happened before you sort of go off and say, okay, the person who tweeted that, they must be right. I mean, they have all the inside information about how this was faked. There's clear that anyone can mount almost anything on the internet. There's very little check on it right now, and you have to have the ability. And that calls on the citizen to develop their own sense of citizenship, knowledge of their society, knowledge of the things around them. It means reading the papers, the newspapers. It means reading and sort of broadening your understanding to see how what you're learning and what you're finding on the internet, how it can be measured and sort of understood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't think that solves the problem, but...
Hello. I just had a general question. In a world where there's a lot more awareness and immediate reporting on these kind of events that may involve or surround conspiracy theories in the news, especially major tragedies, do you have any thoughts on how anyone from like a journalist to kind of a common person in taking all of this information can handle these concepts in the immediate aftermath of the reporting without bringing further harm or attention to the conspiracy?
It's a good question.
Really great question, thank you. It is important to, and this is something that, I struggled with a book, and that we struggle with every day, in the media. How do you debunk these conspiracy theories without, drawing more adherents to them? I try to focus on, and I do this in the book religiously, on the victims of those theories rather than the substance of them. And I sometimes see coverage of this that you can tell the conspiracy theorists like it because it glamorizes what they're doing and what they're saying. I try to focus just on the impact. And, we didn't really talk about that here, but just briefly, it is like people who have had to move, like the Posners had to move house a dozen times in the 10 years since the shooting because their address was being put online and people were coming to their homes. People looking in the family members' windows, digging through their trash, threatening their lives, calling their phone, defacing memorials to the dead, all of these things. I try to focus on this because that stirs up people who are good people who will do things and to try and push for a solution.
Elizabeth, do you know if any other families of mass shootings have been treated the same way the families of Sandy Hook? Like, have other families moved 10 times so they won't be treated the same way as these families?
I would say the number of moves that Lenny and Veronique, Noah's mom, have had to go through is sort of a special case in a way, because just the sheer number, because they took a very forward role, so they were instantly identifiable with the battle against the hoaxers. So they were targeted specifically for that. But yes, unfortunately, the survivors of mass shootings, people after the Las Vegas shooting, still in their hospital beds, were actually logging on to Facebook to post themselves as safe, and seeing people calling them liars and crisis actors while they were still being hospitalized. So it does happen after every shooting. The Sandy Hook families were kind of the first.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. So earlier you talked about conspiracy theories as having a long Anglo tradition. Having spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East, I know that the Arab world can spin a conspiracy yarn as big as anybody, and it strikes me more of a human condition that exists in places where they sense secrets are being kept from various people, just like it exists in many of these Arab world governments, and I'm sure in other places as well. And that the real origin of these conspiracies is when somebody perceives, rightly or wrongly, that some kind of fact is being hidden from them. And that's the sewer that the con men like Alex Jones live in, because he preys on their erroneous beliefs. And to that extent, the belief that I hear this a lot, well, we should talk about the shooter's name or anything like that. Doesn't that kind of feed into the idea that somebody somewhere out there is hiding a fact from me, and therefore I need to go somewhere else to an alternate sphere to find the real truth, and then these hucksters come in and sweep up that kind of information?
First, I had heard, my understanding is from people who've lived in the Arab world and lived and people from the Arab world, is that conspiracy theory is indeed very common there. At the heart of all conspiracy theory is that, in my view, is that it's the belief that whatever is happening, somebody is benefiting from that, and that it's a discernible movement of a hidden group of people who are going to benefit from this. They want something, whether it be to abolish the Second Amendment, to do whatever it is to do. So when you have that, what you really have is the belief that everything you're seeing is a result of the conscious actions of certain actors who think they're going to benefit from this or get something they want from it. And when you have that belief, of course, you can read it into everything, literally everything. And so it becomes common, and it becomes hard then to dissuade people that, look, for example, Sandy Hook happened, or Holocaust deniers, that the Holocaust happened. If you want to believe that, it's hard to dissuade people, but it's the belief that somehow somebody is benefiting, and that they're in control of events in a way that you're not in control, and that it's being hidden from you.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. I just had a quick question about the ethics of journalism. So on the one hand, as a journalist, you're an employee of a company, and you have the responsibility towards your shareholders and the beneficiaries of the company, which might include publishing something that would generate a lot of internet traffic, like a conspiracy or a conspiracy mongering article, or something that can contribute to a conspiracy theory. So how do you reconcile that as being an employee with also being a journalist and having that responsibility towards presenting the truth to society, if that makes sense?
I think the earlier question sort of spoke to a similar issue. How do you draw attention to the existence of this climate of disinformation that we're living in without glamorizing it or glorifying the bad actors? And we just simply try never to do that. And when you talk about generating traffic for when I write about for the New York Times, I find that describing this battle for truth is really the way I do it, and that gains plenty of readers on its own, because I think people recognize that this battle is extant, and that it is continuing, and that the right way to cover it is to talk about its impact on people.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the excellent talk. It seems pretty clear that the changes in the communications technology, especially with the internet and social media, are driving, a similar revolution in conspiratorial thought, similar to what we've seen with the rise of print media. And, looking back at the past, eventually people figure out how to deal with the rise of new forms of media, but sometimes it can be a very rough road with things like, the wars of religion or even World War II. So standing where we are today, can we see, just how rocky of a road is ahead of us as we figure out how to deal with new forms of media, or are these changes so greater in scope and magnitude than what's happened in the past that we just have no idea where this is going to go?
This
Let you
calls
both answer
for
that one.
historical context.
How rocky a road, is that what you're asking? Boulders are ahead, boulders. It's not going to be easy because we have certain people, because we want to have a free and open society. And in that society, one of the risks is that you're going to have some issues that people, in other words, you're going to have, in this case, a freedom of information that's unprecedented, and you're going to have to learn how to come to terms with that. And so I see a very boulderish road ahead in which we really do struggle to come to terms with this. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, and I certainly don't think we're anywhere near the end of that road right now. Technology's changing too quickly, the society's changing quickly.
But one thing I think is really important to note, and Brandon's book, The Brethren, puts this very well, and that in reading his book, I found myself reassured that we have these spasms in our history, and that this isn't something wholly unprecedented. And the parallel between the plot to kidnap and assassinate the leadership of North Carolina in 1777 versus 2020 and Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. It tells you something that, that in itself is a little bit hopeful, because you can see that this is a feature of our society, of our country, of our development, and that, these spasms can be gotten over.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming today. My question is, do you feel that the harmful conspiracy theories will lessen or continue to grow after the Alex Jones trials?
I think the absolute, victory that the families have achieved in bringing these lawsuits and now, confronting him in court. And by the way, there are 2 more trials for damages ahead against Alex Jones, including a big one in a couple of weeks in Connecticut, which is being brought by the families of 8 Sandy Hook victims, is highlighting this phenomenon, showing the human impact of it, the absolutely devastating effects it can have on people who are already traumatized. So I think it makes other would-be conspiracy purveyors think twice about what they're going to do. Not everybody has the resources Alex Jones does to absorb these kinds of judgments and verdicts. So that's my hope.
I was going to ask you, now, I feel like Alex Jones has been put aside. Is there another Alex Jones type that's on the horizon that could maybe reformulate the formula that he did?
I'm going to punt this to Brendan because of the historical nature here, but yes, there are many, and that is partly because it is in our national character to question official narratives.
Yeah, question official narratives, be suspicious of authority. I would also say, in answer to your question, we're at the end of this long and terrible epidemic. There's a lot of course, political division. We're now in the sort of shadow of 2 long, contentious, and unsuccessful wars. So it depends on what the course of events is going forward. If there's less, if there's a longer period of relative stability, I think the opportunity for this hardcore kind of Alex Jones type conspiracy theorist to spread something will diminish. It won't go away, and it's never going away, but it would diminish if the society remains in the level of dislocation and turmoil and atomization that we're at right now because of all these various challenges. The soil remains very fertile for it, I think. I think that's a fair way to think about it historically.
It looks like we have just time for one quick question, sir. We'll give you the last one.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I was wondering if you had any recommendations for the audience. How can we more critically evaluate the information we see on social media? What tips can we verify that information and really check its veracity?
That'd be a good way to end today.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, it's with a longer answer than we have time for, but the trustworthy sources of information haven't changed. And I'm not saying that one shouldn't question my employer or, other mainstream media accounts. But I think one of the keys is for people to get out of that mode in which we have so much media out there, so many choices, that people tend to choose the one that closely corresponds with their political beliefs, and that may not it's not necessarily feeding them falsehoods, but it's definitely coloring the world in a way that makes them comfortable. I think if we consume an array of media, and there's information out there. We know that the InfoWars of the world are not trustworthy sources of news. But if we graze a little more widely, I think that is one step. It's important to know what people outside your media bubble are thinking and questioning in order to more efficiently argue with them.
The groupthink of the algorithm, yeah.
Could I just address that? I think one thing that is important is if you look at the sources of your information, books, old media, new media, visual, television or other visual things. In other words, going across platforms, going across the type of information you get, that helps you get a better grip of how to weigh what you're hearing and come to a kind of rational conclusion about it. I think that is important, that it's not just one source, that you're going across what we call platforms, right, to look for different kinds of information about given problems, given people, given issues, given events. I think that's important.
Thank you.
Thanks for your great question.
And thank you to the two of you. We appreciate it so much, both Brendan and Elizabeth.